Welcome to State Space, where we illustrate the today and tomorrow of the science acceleration landscape. In this episode, we sit down with Josh Noon, Director of Policy at SeedAI, to hear his insights on accelerating science through AI, policy challenges, and innovative models like autonomous labs and focused research organizations. We explore how to unlock AI's potential for scientific breakthroughs and the role of policy in fostering a more dynamic research ecosystem.
For our first episode, I wanted somebody who could help us get us our footing in the AI for science space. Joshua New is Director of Policy at SeedAI, a nonprofit focused on America AI readiness. He runs a team who I've heard is quite wonderful, thinking about how we handle AI policy in a way that actually pays off both economically and scientifically. He spent years in the science and tech world, and I think that makes him a good person to sort of plant our footing in the AI for science space. Josh New, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start off with your path to sort of SeedAI and the AI policy space. Where did you start off? Were you always super bullish on AI? And how did you get here?
Sure. So I started in the tech policy space in 2014 out of undergrad. I basically a political science major, but also knew how a computer worked. And at the time, that meant you could work in tech policy, right? Mm-hmm. That was few and far between. So I was working at the Information Technology Innovation Foundation's Center for Data Innovation, which is a mouthful, but focused on a pretty broad emerging tech portfolio, but around data-driven innovation. So that means I got to see all the big buzzwords come and go. So big data used to be a proper noun. You capitalize the B and the D.
Oh, yeah.
Then the Internet of Things, smart cities, precision medicine. AI started becoming more and more prevalent, and now we can do this thing now. Isn't this interesting? Probably around 2016, I think it started really coming to dominate my attention, and I realized this is going to matter in a really, really profound way. So I started a little bit after then what I think was the first community practice of AI policy in DC around then. We ran congressional education classes around what AI is. And then after, GPT-2 had come out, and that was the first time when a research lab started to question publicly, is open source something that we need to be a lot more careful about? And that was really sort of the inflection point of oh man, the amount of attention is going to go up and to the right, just like AI is. And was there for a while. The ChatGPT moment kind of a few years later blew that into the public consciousness. But I was there for about 5 years, and then I went to IBM, where I led a lot of the generative AI policy portfolio, the government affairs team, but got to do a lot of work with IBM research and a lot of R&D policy and stuff in the open innovation, open science space, which was a really, really fun time. And then joined Seed about 2 years ago. Something that I've always been really, really animated by, though, and sort of get starry-eyed and optimistic, and is the idea that, this is a technology that can meaningfully deliver all the things that we hope technology could do for us, right? Mm-hmm. Make us happier, healthier, wealthier, live more long, fulfilling lives, solve things that we didn't even know we needed solving necessarily, because it was just so outside of the realm of the possible or conceivable. And you started seeing the implications of AI for science very, very early on, right? A lot of AI was a very commonplace technology in a almost quaint sense nowadays, pre-transformer era. But it was used in medical imaging and diagnostics, in drug discovery, in agriculture science, in weather modeling. Mm-hmm. This was always a tool for science. Long before it was a commercial or consumer facing technology. And then we've just seen breakthrough after breakthrough or promising new capability after capability at almost an exponential clip. Mm-hmm. And so very fortunate that I get to do a lot of this as my job now.
Yeah. Totally. So I guess just to stay on that for a moment, when you're talking about, starting off in the tech policy space and sort of nobody kind of you know how a computer works, and that gives you credit to work in science policy. How have the conversations that you've seen sort of change as the tech policy world becomes more sort of technically capable, I guess, or kind of more understanding of how these specific technologies work, especially in kind of the realm of AI, where, I think if you talk to the average person 10 years ago, they might kind of like have an idea of like, oh, AI is like a chatbot or like Siri or something, versus now when you have most people kind of understanding this idea of like transformers and like generative AI and like, stochastic parrots and that whole sort of thing. So how do those conversations change when technical capability sort of becomes more par for the course, I guess?
So I think the defining conversation you would have in like 2016 is like, no, Senator, it's not the Terminator.
Yeah.
Like, yes, we know you've seen Minority Report. This is not really the same thing.
Yeah.
And really just like trying to get people to pay attention was a win. People are certainly paying attention now. So you no longer have to do as much work convincing people that this matters. What I'm very encouraged by is like the level of recognition in Congress, in the administration, in state governments and local governments, and in everyone's backyard. This is a kitchen table issue now of like, this is really a big deal with the first letter of those words very capitalized. What I still think there's a lot of work to be done. Is that, this isn't just like a DC problem or a policy problem. This is like a human thing. Is that the defining feature of AI in today's world is that it's getting better very quickly. And it gets better at a faster clip, right? Like the delta on the delta is changing. And DC in general is slow to respond to like fast moving technologies. But you'll have sort of these instances of like, okay, we did the study, we did the commission, we now get AI. But that's 2 years old. And like the state of the opportunity space is so dramatically evolved. There's new threats, there's new challenges, there's new weird dynamics at play, where we're really bad at sort of creating a coherent policy apparatus or understanding around something that is so rapidly changing by its own nature. And so the work is never done. What still frustrates me every now and then, though, is that you'll have people who very, very smart, very busy. This is not like a personal failing, right? But like, they've tried AI, right? Like they tried ChatGPT when it came out, like 2 years ago, or like they're using models to do help me draft an email, which is totally fine. That could be the best way that this is your entry point to the technology, when that is just like the tip of the iceberg of what this technology actually is. And I think that makes it harder to sort of extrapolate or understand what this means for like entire scientific disciplines, or understanding its impact on the economy, or like labor market disruption, or like the resilience of social institutions, right? Like all these things are, I think, really, really hard to grasp just because they're big and weird. And if you haven't experienced that big weirdness like up close in front of you on your computer, I think you're starting at a disadvantage.
So something I'm interested to just like kind of probe you on a little bit is like, I've thought about this idea of like, I think a lot of people talk about a little bit more nowadays of like the saturation of like how people use models, right? Like the idea that like for what I do on an average day or a daily basis, like I won't need to use Fable to really kind of get my maximum sort of utility out of it, right? So how do you think about like this idea of like the exponential growth versus like how it might be integrated into daily scientific workflows? Like, is that, when you were talking about AI for science, like, is it about like, oh, we're going to use Fable for something we don't even like have a regular workflow for yet? Or is it like there's still sort of more to be seen with this sort of saturation? Like our current workflow is going to saturate and like we're going to see new ones open up, or is kind of the whole saturation model not really like a fair kind of perspective?
I think we are still so early in terms of just like basic exposure in research ecosystems. I'm not naming names, but I've had conversations with professional, very, very talented scientists. They lead large labs. And they say like, if you give these models to a team of researchers, like their natural inclination is like, oh, cool, we're going to tinker with the engine, rather than like, we're going to pick a place on the map and go to it. It's this new thing that we have. And that is a hard gulf to overcome when budgets are limited, when you don't necessarily have the compute or like the token budget to like do things at scale. If you don't have the training, if you don't have the people with like the dual competencies of like sophisticated neuroscience, and also they like understand AI workflows and orchestration really well. That is a major sort of rate limiter on progress in the space. I think we are still, but even like, right, if I would try to like articulate what some early wins might be the low hanging fruit of just like being able to do grant preparation or literature reviews or a lot of like the routine business of doing science that takes up a ton of people's time with language models. I'm not going to estimate like how much of the research like successfully does this now, but surely it's not enough. Right? Either you don't have like institutional permission to use it, you don't have internal champions that are like educating others as much as you'd like. You have some sort of like cultural resistance or reluctance to embrace new technologies. There could be a lack of trust in a lot of these spaces. There could be regulatory burdens, right? There could be licensing issues and questions around like data governance that are just too much to like, we can't figure that out. We're just going to keep doing this. And we're going to throw some grad students at this problem. So we're still very, very early. I hope like other parts of this dynamic that also starts changing fast.
Sure. So when you're talking in like AI policy from your perspective, you're more so thinking of how do we sort of like with what AI is already capable of doing, how do we sort of unlock that potential and allow everybody to already use its capabilities that already exist versus where I think a lot of people might think about like AI policy as a mechanism to decide where it goes almost like and sort of steering it that way. Like what would you say is sort of like how you think about that?
So yeah, I mean with SeedAI itself, outside of work with Accelerated Science now, focuses on like the broader policy ecosystem. You know, there are regulatory conversations, there are conversations around like frontier governance and the standards and evaluation ecosystem. But AI policy is vast, and I think the like exciting frontier governance challenges take up a lot of the oxygen. Understandably so. It's very important stuff. But there's like such a huge, I think, under-prioritized space of focusing on like AI diffusion and meaningful adoption and integration and like modernizing approval pathways and institutional design and how we like give money to fund research and all these different things that are not really equipped to adapt to an AI-driven scientific ecosystem. There's also sort of this other dynamic at play too, where when we're talking about like AI doing science or something, or just like modern technologies, all of which have AI now, I think, built into them in some point in the stack, like autonomous labs or something that are very exciting. I think, and again, this is understandable, it just shouldn't be like the end all, is that you have a lot of, I think, really promising early pilots that are like, what if we could automate a lab? What would that look like? And I'm being a little bit reductive here, but it's really about like, okay, you know, labs are designed like this. You have like 5 rows of benches and you have like 4 humans in each one. And we're just going to put robotic arms there. That's an automated lab, but that is not really thinking about like how you can rebuild the lab around the potential of AI. And you know, there's risk tolerance at play. There's like academic budgets that are not necessarily going to be able to be so ambitious to like redesign how research is done in the lab because like they feel excited about it. There's federal grants that are going to be limiting factors here based on like what they're asking for, what you're required to deliver. But that is another part of here that I think we don't spend enough time on as like an ecosystem, but something that we're really focused on. It's like, how do we actually reimagine this whole potential? How can policy be a mechanism to like help drive that change or create that opportunity space?
So I guess kind of on that note, when you're talking about like AI diffusion into like science more broadly and lab work, I think people often talk about this idea of like decentralized science as being kind of like the ideal model for at least American science because, you know, you get to mitigate institutional biases, you have more kind of like a groundswell of consensus making, and it's more democratic, I guess would be the most ideal way of formulating that opinion. How do you sort of pair that with, you know, I guess like the question would be, why do we need to intervene at all, right? If science is so good decentralized, then why do we need to try to, I guess, intervene in terms of promoting AI adoption? Like, why shouldn't we just let everybody kind of do it on their own? Are they even capable of doing that?
Something we've been thinking about a lot is that like the rate at which science happens is isn't like an organic thing that exists independently in a vacuum, right? Like it is a complicated, the result of like a very complicated, long political equation of like public appetite for R&D spend and like the demand we place on our institutions and like the body politics consensus, either like deliberately or inadvertently we result in this thing. And that has been enough to not move the needle one direction or the other. I think perhaps one of the founding ideas of the Accelerated Science Now Coalition, which we helped launch a little over a year ago now, is that like that is not good enough, right? We need to be doing what we can as members of like the research ecosystem in the public policy world and industry and academia and civil society and philanthropy, and then also like engaging with lawmakers to change that equation such that we like end up at a state where science moves a lot faster. It doesn't just happen in sort of this the trajectory that we're on right now. The decentralized aspect of this is something that we can play to the strengths of, right? Like, and so this is not how all science works, but a method, a like coherent pipeline of doing science is, you'll generate a hypothesis in a public or private lab, but you don't have necessarily the equipment or the expertise or the like warehouse space or whatever to go synthesize a bunch of materials and then test them and then get results back.
Sure.
You would then engage like a contract research organization to do that. And they are specialized and there's a lot in the country and they do good work. But this is all like I think, bit of a clunky process. It is many steps. There's layers of friction there. What if, right? There was just these very, very accessible networks of autonomous cloud laboratories, just like you can go get pretty much as much compute you want on demand through like AWS or a cloud provider or something, for like whenever your website gets more traffic, where you can just run an experiment and have whatever materials you need like automatically synthesized and tested with like zero downtime, no matter where it is in the country, because you have like 10x more contract research organizations that are operating autonomously in a warehouse somewhere. They have like free humans on site for like security or something.
Sure.
And science can just move like that much faster because you removed all those different points of friction. That's great. I think that promotes the democratization and the decentralization that makes like innovation and competition and different theories of change or whatever to all flourish and sort of happen at the same time without having like this weird centralizing body that decides what science can happen and when. But we still get to put our foot on the gas. And so focusing on removing those barriers as like a main function is something we care a lot about. We think about like, what are the blockers that we can remove and what are the enablers that we can support?
Well, so on that note, I guess I do want to talk more about the Accelerated Science Now Coalition, but when you're talking about sort of what are these blockers, what are these rate limiters, and like the sort of like levers that you use to change the equation that you're talking about, what do those levers sort of look like? Like, are you trying to get the right ideas in the right people's hands? Are you trying to put people in the same like room together? Like, what does that kind of look like on a day-to-day or like an operationalizing basis?
It's daunting, but also kind of fun to be able to get to say like, all the above. So let's do all of it.
Sure.
Of course, there's limited political capital in the world and you have to choose how to spend it wisely. Some of the things that I think are like the obvious targets for blockers that we should be focused on removing are like how we kind of administer research in the United States. And I talked a little bit about this before, where researchers spend a ton of their time doing, and I think they would maybe also describe this as like pretty dull, boring kind of grunt work, right? Like paperwork, drafting like data governance plans, managing data, responding to like administrative procedures that require like certain kinds of reporting, certain kinds of checkpoints, certain kinds of milestones. Like the reason we demand all these things is because like we want accountability for our research dollars. We want like standard to like compare outcomes. We want to be able to like validate researchers are in standing, whatever. Like there are explanations for this. This doesn't just happen because someone's lazy. But we can certainly do things differently or experiment with new models for doing this. One effort like this that's been very promising that we, as a coalition have praised and put forth ideas to help support. To talk to the National Science Foundation about this is like the NSF's X Labs proposal, which is designed to sort of take a much more modern, almost like startup model for doing big, ambitious science, kind of loosely modeled after what's known as like a focused research organization or an FRO, or a FRO. I think DC should be an FRO. It's an acronym town. To do much more nimble, sort of flexible, big, ambitious, long-term science in a way that can bypass a lot of those friction points. We have not really ever done that, right? Like this NSF funding can be available to a wider group of people than traditional academic researchers. The teams are going to look different. The PIs are going to look different. The resources they have are going to be different. And it's just like a new model that we can start experimenting with. Interesting, right? Like this isn't like an AI thing. Right?
Yeah.
But I think AI has sort of created a lot of the activation energy to start solving a lot of these, or start giving us the juice, as it were, to tackle other problems that make science slower than it ought to be, and it might otherwise be, around the potential of new emerging technologies.
Yeah.
So sort of administrative blockers are a big one. One area of like enablers that we think is really important too is, and it's going to almost sounds boring to say, but it's like infrastructure. But I think like infrastructure can have a pretty expansive definition.
Sure.
The thing that we're excited about is like data infrastructure, and specifically like new valuable data sets themselves as a substrate for scientific discovery. So everyone likes to talk about this example. It almost feels like a bit old hat at this point, but like AlphaFold won the Nobel Prize.
Got it.
Only enabled because of like decades and decades of federal investment, but not just the federal government, but federal support for the National Protein Data Bank. This created like a really, really rich, expansive data set of protein structures in usable formats and available to researchers. And that was like a large corpus of training data that went to AlphaFold. And this does feel cliche, but like, people often want, like, we want AlphaFold for X. We want to be able to do this for material science or high energy physics or chemistry or whatever. We'll say quantum science. That's absolutely true. But we don't have those same kinds of data infrastructure resources available to all researchers, private sector, academic alike. We think it would be an incredibly good idea to fund the creation of these kind of data sets. These are things that the Department of Energy or the National Science Foundation or other research agencies could fund directly. These are things that they could work with industry and philanthropy to support. But we just historically haven't really approached the problem of like, how can we advance new breakthroughs by like investing and funding solely the creation of data sets. It's normally like, we're going to fund your research in this direction, and then like you'll probably publish your data. Maybe sometimes you won't. You won't really enforce data publication with it. Like there's neither carrot nor stick to do so. And that has sort of created, it's not a tragedy of the commons, but it's something like that where like a lot of taxpayer dollars have funded the generation of this data, but it isn't always made available to the public. And it isn't always like for the express purpose of producing like a large body of data available to scientific researchers. We hope that changes.
So I guess just like kind of on that note of these like kind of new models, I'm always interested because a lot of people talk about FROs, right, as like this kind of new model and new way that we should try doing research. It's very like milestone oriented. It's kind of very about like getting all the right people, no matter where they're from, to solve a specific problem. I guess my question would be, is that really a new model? When I think about like stuff like the Manhattan Project, for example, like that's very old at this point. And it seems kind of similar in a way where it's like we have this goal of creating a technology, and we are going to put a bunch of people in a room together who we think are the best to do that. Obviously, the most people who are apt to do that at that point were physicists and academic physicists. How do like, I guess when we're like talking about new sort of milestone based like funding models and sort of research models, how much are we building off of stuff that already existed and versus kind of really approaching things in a new way, I guess is the question.
So it's a bit of both. I do think it is useful to articulate that like we don't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel here, right? Like there's we've been doing science for a long time. We've done a lot of experiments. It doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing more kinds of novel experiments in models for science, but there are best practices that we can pull from that we just maybe haven't like stuck with or applied in a modern context. So want to acknowledge the ASN Coalition member Convergent Research, which has been pioneering in the space of sort of maturing an FRO model and launching many. This is really cool. It doesn't look that dissimilar from how certain research agencies do fund some research.
Sure.
So, like I know DARPA, for example, has a different method for funding research than the National Science Foundation does, or the NIH does, or the Department of Energy does, that is sometimes more nimble, sometimes more milestone based, sometimes more like ambitious project team lead based than just giving a grant to an external institution with certain check-ins and et cetera. Another coalition member of Renaissance Philanthropy has a whole program where they basically, in the US and in other countries, train people to be like the equivalent of a DARPA program manager for a national research agency, with sort of the skill sets, the managerial expertise, the mode of operating where you can like implement that approach to solving big, ambitious, hard problems in like a government funded context. You mentioned Manhattan Project. I think that's kind of like singular, but there are other big examples where we like recognized, oh, the current method for solving big things isn't really working. What if we tried something new?
Yeah.
The Human Genome Project is a really good example of this, of like a very ambitious moonshot. There's a professor at Carnegie Mellon University, which is also a coalition member named Tom Mitchell, who wrote this great paper sort of urging a move away from what's like the Lone Ranger model of science, which is basically you have like an ambitious academic runs a lab somewhere, gets a grant, they deploy their team of grad students and PhD students, and like they do a thing, and then they move on. And then they do the next thing or whatever. Whereas, you know, that is good for some kinds of problems, but it is not really great for solving like big problems that require like large distributed teams working on like incremental milestones towards a large goal over time. The Human Genome Project was like, oh yeah, what if we did things differently? And it was like a massive, massive effort. I've heard plenty of criticism of like how the money was spent, of like what was actually valuable worth investing in. But it was a very large distributed research project with incremental goals, with a very clear milestone, or target that was going to take many years to get there, required a lot of different teams operating on different parts of the problem. And look where we are today with like genomic sequencing, and we have the human genome sequence, and it costs like fractions of what it used to sequence a genome. And we've like given birth to like a very large like consumer genomics industry, among many other things. And then we kind of stopped doing that. Which like, again, there are going to be many reasons for, but like, there's no reason why we can't look to those lessons to keep applying them. I do also want to point out that one of the things that I think is like really fascinating is that if you look at like the history of the Human Genome Project, it was deeply unpopular with a lot of the research community.
Really?
Right? Because there was a lot of sort of pride of ownership of like this Lone Ranger model of being able to own your own research and set your own research directions and like not necessarily have to collaborate and share. And it was like through pretty aggressive political force of will that forced us to overcome that sort of institutional barrier. I think we are going to keep seeing stuff like that as we are rethinking how we do a lot of academic research or big ambitious science.
Sure.
Like name any like big moonshot, like very famously like the going to the moon. Right. The first moonshot was not especially popular until it happened. And so like there's this weird dynamic at play where doing things differently creates a lot of friction. It creates some antagonism. But I think it doesn't mean it's not worth doing. And hopefully we can minimize the amount of friction to like doing these big missions.
And now people look back to when we did the moon, like the first moonshot. They're like, wow, this is amazing.
You get starry-eyed about it, right? But if I think a certain set of people who thought about science in a certain way had their way, we probably would have done it. And that doesn't mean it wasn't without trade-offs, right? There are good arguments to be made about the broader calculus of how we're spending our federal dollars. But like, I think people gloss over the fact that like, oh, there was a time when everyone agreed, we should do X, Y, and Z things. No brainers are going to be great and be like the pride of the nation. And we just haven't encountered that kind of problem. It's like, no, we're just not thinking about things in the way that we probably should because of this not weird, but you know, this sort of institutional opposition, or we are anchored on a set of capabilities that we have that are probably out of date. And we should be thinking about the opportunity space a little bit more creatively.
Yeah, totally. I think one of the great ways to kind of mitigate that institutional opposition is by getting a bunch of people from different disciplines in the same room together who are working on the same problem, which I think the Accelerate Science Now Coalition does very well. I was wondering if, just to round out the episode, if you could talk a little bit about what that, what the sort of ASN model is, sort of as like this connective tissue between the different areas of policy and AI and science, and what does that connective tissue do that like a singular sort of funder or lab can't?
Sure. So the Accelerate Science Now Coalition is a year and change old. I think we launched in like February of 2025. We weren't by no means like the first organization or coalition or association ever to say like AI can accelerate science. Science should go faster. It should be more productive. It should be more efficient. But a lot of what we are seeing in the both like technical community and the sort of policy community, right? Technical side, you had things like AlphaFold. You had like a litany of news stories of a really interesting new AI-enabled scientific thing, or science doing something creative and exciting and faster than we did before. But it was largely piecemeal, right? It was like one-off efforts, often out of private labs. Not necessarily as part of like this coordinated like national ambitious effort of a research ecosystem. On the political side, you had an enormous amount of, and you still do, enormous amount of like general awareness that AI can boost productivity, that technology is progressing and we can harness it to do all these wonderful things, but not really a coherent strategy to like act on that. And so the sort of the founding activation energy for the coalition was like those circles, there's a middle of the Venn diagram here, that there should be a very large, a big tent organization focused on sort of capturing some of that energy and like providing useful recommendations, doing useful things in the world that would help, merge or align the stars, so to speak. I'm speaking a little bit too abstractly. Our mode of operating, though, has been, we want to be very expansive. We have 80-something members, major frontier labs, very early stage biotech startups, scientific philanthropies and funders, think tanks, academic institutions, R1s, and then you also have, the National Applied AI Consortium, a network of community colleges, and a lot of other different kinds of institutions that you might not always think is part of like the cutting edge scientific system. But I think one of the things we talk about a lot is that like the scientific pipeline is vast, and it's everything from like big, ambitious, heady, novel breakthrough moonshot to like the long tail of technology transfer and diffusion. And every part of the scientific pipeline could benefit from rethinking how we apply new technologies and how we like overcome institutional barriers and create new enablers to be more productive, to be more focused on things that people care about, to translate all these breakthroughs into people's lives, get them into people's pockets, into people's bloodstreams, whatever, that are all part of this conversation that historically I think have been left out when I'm talking about like, how do we do science, in quotes or something. So we are, we've done a lot of sort of policymaker education. We've done a lot of advising for federal agencies. We've done a lot of like public RFIs. Some of the work that I'm excited to get into now that we've sort of grown and have this managed resistance, have such a really expensive network, is start tackling some of those big enablers that I mentioned. So we're starting some work around how do we identify and fund the creation of like valuable data sets that could enable AI-driven scientific capabilities that could unlock really valuable breakthroughs. Building on some of the lessons of coalition members, like the Astaire Institute, Renaissance Philanthropy, et cetera. But then like, how is that scalable? How could that be packaged for policymakers? So it's like, it's not just one association doing this kind of work. It could be scaled. I'm really excited to get a lot into the scientific AI benchmarking space. One potentially crude, but I think worth pursuing theory of change here is that like progress in AI capabilities tracks loosely with where you can measure AI capabilities. And I think there's a lot of domains of science where we don't have great benchmarks for tracking progress. If those benchmarks were to be created, you would have people that are trying to hill climb and prove that they can do AI in this capacity. And that would steer progress in directions that we all value. But I think there's like no shortage of work that we could do. And so for all the folks listening at home, if this is something that excites you and you want to join the coalition, this is, it's easy to join. It's free. And we look forward to work with you.
Cool. I think that's a perfect place to end. Josh New, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to State Space. I'm your host, Zane Yaman. This show is produced by Accelerate Science Now and SeedAI, and our executive producers are Josh New and Austin Carson. We want to give a special thanks to Good Speech for editing and production. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.